Hello, I'm Norman Kelly. Welcome to From Black Power to Black Trauma, a podcast that challenges today's racial discourse. Without question, the Middle Passage, the voyage of enslaved Africans to the New World, was a traumatic experience. Undoubtedly, the institution of slavery was a traumatic one, as well as Jim Crow segregation from the end of the Civil War up until the Civil Rights Movement. However, it should be questioned if the postmodern trauma narrative that has been devised in the academy is applicable to African Americans 50 years after the Civil Rights Movement. Blacks have not been traumatized as this trauma narrative would have it, but have instead demobilized themselves to the point where this corrosive trauma narrative has become an exercise in victimology. This series argues that the current political malaise affecting African American politics can be traced back to the decisions and events of the 1960s and 1970s, in which African American politics stalled and became the new status quo. Despite the successes of the Civil Rights Movement and the rhetoric of Black Power, Black political mobilization failed to go from protest to politics. Episode 3, Harry B. and the Missed Opportunity, will explore Black leadership's inability to create an autonomous cultural apparatus, as well as a permanent fundraising mechanism to keep the Black struggle for full freedom ongoing during the post-Civil Rights years. As outlined in Episode 2, The Lost Agenda, going from protest to politics as advocated by Bayard Rustin didn't happen. The moderate civil rights movement, by the time of King's assassination, had dissipated. It was not able to present its freedom budget to alleviate poverty and encourage full employment. Black Power adherents wanted Blacks to work independently without white allies. However, other than promoting Black arts, Black heritage, and Black consciousness, Black Power didn't achieve any of the goals, especially those set forth in the 1972 National Black Political Convention. Failing to build on the successes of the past, as well as keeping an eye on anti-civil rights backsliding, post-civil rights leadership has failed to create and adapt new strategies and tactics during the post-civil rights years, while those who oppose the civil rights agenda and liberalism did. The three most important occurrences of the 1960s were: 1. The change in the legal and social status of Blacks, by which they were no longer second-class citizens. 2. The terrorism regime inflicted upon Southern Blacks ended, allowing them to vote and to assume political offices. 3. Then Negroes became Black people who embraced their Blackness, but within the context of the American experience. Post-civil rights leadership, whether integrationist or oppositional, did not build an effective political infrastructure upon the successes of the 1960s. While Blacks achieved greater electoral success in local, state, and federal elections, it's questionable if those successes led to greater material and social improvement in the lives of the Black poor and working classes. While the Black arts movement and Black Power led to greater self-consciousness among Black people themselves, neither of those two movements, which both began in the mid-60s and ended by the mid-70s, were able to sustain themselves as popular and or autonomous movements outside of academia. By the mid-70s, most of the activist organizations that had filed legal briefs, led marches, sit-ins, and other direct action maneuvers had either disappeared or returned to status quo ante. Interestingly, movement conservatism, also known as the New Right, which rose from the debacle of the Goldwater campaign in 1964, and documents such as the Powell Memo did so. A network of conservative foundations, think tanks, fundraising mechanisms, and the media became a counter-establishment to a liberalism. Conservatism began a permanent campaign that sought to get its agenda into the halls of power. However, post-civil rights leadership didn't. The civil rights movement failed to go from protest to politics by the simple fact that it didn't build a post-charismatic political infrastructure that could have used the March on Washington's egalitarian promises to fuel greater participation by whites and blacks. By 1963, the Civil Rights Movement had inspired 200,000 Americans to come to Washington to peacefully and nonviolently seek a redress of grievances. It had amassed, on August 28, 1963, a nonviolent people's army that it didn't put into the field when the movement needed it.
Standing before the Lincoln Memorial on the 28th of August,
A. Philip Randolph.
in the centennial year of emancipation, I affirm my complete personal commitment to the struggle for jobs and freedom for Americans. To fulfill that commitment, I pledge that I will not relax until victory is won. I pledge that I will join and support all actions undertaken in good faith, in accord with the time-honored democratic tradition of nonviolent protest, of peaceful assembly and petition, and of redress through the courts and the legislative process. I pledge to carry the message of the march to my friends and neighbors back home and arouse them to an equal commitment and equal effort. I will march and I will write letters. I will demonstrate and I will vote. I will work to make sure that my voice and those of my brothers ring clear and determined from every corner of our land. I pledge my heart and my mind and my body unequivocally and without regard to personal sacrifice to the achievement of social peace through social justice.
How do you pledge?
The March on Washington pledge was a missed opportunity for the Civil Rights Movement. It failed to capitalize on the spirit of democratic egalitarianism that the march had engendered. If 200,000 people were at the march but no follow-up occurred regarding building a membership-based organization, then Bayard Rustin's strategy of going from protest to politics failed. Had A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin developed a true programmatic and/or organizational vision, the 200,000 pledges or a reasonable portion thereof could have been used to finance and mobilize the next phase of the Civil Rights Movement, namely economics, which was the focus of the Freedom Budget. However, in order to do so, a visionary leadership would be required. That, unfortunately, appeared to be in short supply after King's assassination. Yet, there might have been an opportunity to have at least one person who could have pulled off something unique regarding post-civil rights mobilization and institution building. And that person was a singer, actor, and activist, a go-between the various factions and organizations and individuals. Let me give you a hint.
Deo, Deo, daylight coming, we won't go home.
We're speaking of Mr. Handsomeness himself, Harry Belafonte. Belafonte was pivotal in the early days of the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s. His New York apartment was headquarters of the northern contingent of the movement, where King and others gathered to plot strategy. As well as being described as a lieutenant of Martin Luther King, Belafonte had the ear of the Kennedy administration and actually sat on the advisory board of the newly formulating Peace Corps. He was also instrumental in assisting Martin Luther King's legal defense on the committee to defend Martin Luther King when Alabama charged him with that criminal tax violation. Belafonte was also a conduit between the Kennedy administration, SCLC, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee during the Freedom Rise. Belafonte was committed to the cause of freedom.
Well, civil rights are something that I inherited, or at least a struggle for civil rights. I got it from my mother and my father, and they got it from their mothers and their fathers.
Harry Belafonte, speaking at a Hollywood roundtable hours after the March on Washington.
And to be in Washington today was for me an accumulation of a number of generations of black Americans who have been trying to appeal to the conscience of white supremacy and a superior force that has denied and disenfranchised the Negro for so long. And that to be in Washington was for me today a beginning, really, a kind of a climax to generations of hope. And having been deeply immersed in the civil rights struggle and having been at the beginning of so many important civil rights issues in this country and demonstrations, it was indeed a very powerful moment to see 200,000 people, mostly black people, but also white people, and to know that a nation such as America, and the reason that I struggle with it so hard and I grapple with it so hard is because I really believe in the potential of this country. And this country has not realized its potential. It has not even begun to scratch its surface in the humanities. And because I do feel strongly about that potential and because of the kind of inheritance I've had, it was necessary for me to be there today.
Harry Belafonte is mostly known as a singer and actor, not as an activist, and certainly not as a behind-the-scenes facilitator.
In terms of Belafonte's strategy,
Emily Raymond, author of Stars for Freedom, Hollywood, Black Celebrities, and the Civil Rights Movement.
Just a couple of examples that I think help illustrate that. He became, he was kind of engaged with the John F. Kennedy administration and was involved in the Peace Corps Advisory Board, was going to meetings at the White House. And at the same time, he also was really interested in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee there and what they were trying to achieve with the freedom rides and the sit-in movement and so forth.
In a chapter of her book, Harry Belafonte and the Northern Liberal Network, Raymond explains the deft maneuvering that was going on.
And the Kennedy administration was it seemed like he was trying to kind of co-opt SNCC and get them involved in voter registration as a way to sort of tamp down the public confrontations that he felt were embarrassing him on the world stage. And it just seemed like Belafonte was able to kind of deftly help the students have a voter registration project that was sort of in line with what Kennedy was thinking. So kept them in his good graces. But at the same time, Belafonte was able to help them not become co-opted by Kennedy by helping them maintain financial independence and helping them kind of remove themselves so they didn't look like they were doing Kennedy's bidding.
It was Belafonte who told Kennedy,
you need to understand Martin Luther King. That's who you need to understand, not a celebrity, because he's a minister and he's on the ground doing these things and is becoming a national spokesperson. And so he helped connect Kennedy and King for the first time, which was really important.
Now, someone such as Belafonte was valuable due to the support he gave to the civil rights movement, but he wasn't a movement leader of an organization. King was, but had been assassinated. As a matter of fact, not only had blacks pushed through to eradicate Jim Crow segregation and second-class citizenship, but had done so while losing Malcolm X in 1965 and King in 1968. But despite those losses, blacks kept on pushing as the Impressionists urged in their 1967-68 anthem, We're a Winner. But blacks had not only lost two inspiring visionary leaders, but had lost two important thought leaders during the 60s. Sociologist E. Franklin Frazier died in 1962, and perhaps America's greatest intellectual, W.B. Du Bois, died in Ghana in 1963 on the same day of the march. Often not recognized was how politically and intellectually decapitated blacks had become, meaning blacks had not only lost leaders, but outstanding thinkers. While the 60s led to the Black Arts Movement, the upsurge of creative expression in the arts, arguably, and despite the rhetoric of Black Power, it did not develop a corresponding Black thought movement of critical thinkers who could help Black Americans collectively take advantage of and make sense of recent successes and move into the future. A good example of this lack of Black thought movement was the rise and fall of the Institute of the Black World, IBW. The Institute of the Black World, IBW, was an activist think tank that tried to synthesize the various strains of Black political thought and orientation in the post-civil rights era, integrationist, Black nationalist, Marxist, etc. It was also instrumental in spearheading the development of Black studies in colleges and universities. Its mission was to make ideas and views available to blacks who recently went from being Negroes to Black people in the aftermath of Martin Luther King and the burgeoning Black Power clamor. IBW was commissioned to develop the Black agenda at the National Black Political Convention in 1972. IBW lasted for 12 years or less, but its model was not sustained by the new Black intelligentsia in the aftermath of its decline. The Institute was undermined by the usual suspects: internal decision, ideological squabbles, lack of sustainable funding, and the FBI's COINTELPRO. Despite an increasing number of educated blacks and wealth in the last 30 years, outside of academia, there are only one or two Black think tanks today. And most people, including blacks, couldn't even name them. The inability of Black leadership to sustain and or develop think tank meant that when white supremacists swapped out Ku Klux Klan uniforms and Bull Connor tactics, post-civil rights leadership was caught in a time warp when it had very little maneuvering room to counter the new tactics and strategy. Lee Atwater, a Republican political operative who later became the chairman of the Republican National Committee, exquisitely explained the code switching and framing of the new conservatism that was rising in the post-civil rights era.
You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts your backfire. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing. And a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, you know. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner.
Black aspiration and needs would no longer be directly attacked, but indirectly by talking about taxes and issues such as forced busing or states' rights, which just happened to disproportionately affect blacks. Post-civil rights leadership was hardly equipped to deal with the new right conservatism. Ideas about the underclass, read poor urban blacks, began spouting out from conservative think tanks as research or in book. It's in this atmosphere that saw the rise of the new conservatism in the 70s, which led to the election of Ronald Reagan by the early 80s and the attack on the civil rights agenda. Remember the pledge? Those 200,000 people were never really organized and called upon. They were never organized into a coherent movement to mobilize their power to peacefully assemble and petition for a redress of grievances through the courts and through the legislative process, and to demonstrate and vote. It was recognized that a new national membership organization was needed, and Harry Belafonte wanted to spearhead such an organization. Belafonte has spoken to Bear Rustin about it. However, that project, discussed in 1960, never came to fruition due to the sit-ins of that period that led to the establishment of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. However, the fact that this was discussed in 1960 and no follow-up was made to establish such an organization after King's assassination was a missed opportunity not built upon previous successes. Another missed opportunity was the civil rights movement not institutionalizing its fundraising mechanisms. As Raymond explained, the various organizations each had different fundraising schemes.
I think in some cases it was kind of ad hoc and spontaneous, and other times it was more organized. It depended on the need. But the NAACP, since it had been around for a long time as an organization, and it had a division within it called the Freedom Fund, and they used that for fundraising. And that was established in the 50s. And when the NAACP asked Sammy Davis Jr. to do fundraising for them, they had that in place. But at the same time, they had never really done fundraising with stars before. And so that part of it was ad hoc, where you're having to deal with like venues and unions and contracts and the whims of performers and that sort of thing, how to make money. So there was a learning process, I think, there. But with other organizations like, SNCC didn't really even start till 1960, and they had no fundraising capabilities. Their initial fundraising came through Jackie Robinson making, phone calls on their behalf. And this Southern Christian Leadership Conference, King's organization, had a very, very small administrative apparatus when it first started. So they had to do trial and error, and sometimes it was based on need. Like, for example, sometimes it would be based on legal needs, bailing people out of jail or paying for a court case. Or it could be planned a little bit more in advance to help get a project off the ground, like Mississippi Freedom Summer, or something like that. So yeah, it seems like it was kind of based on the organization and based on the needs and priorities. And they were able to fundraise in a whole bunch of different ways using celebrities. Sometimes celebrities would have a benefit concert or some kind of benefit show. If they, comedians would do more of a show than a concert. They might have film screenings where ticket sales, would go toward an organization. Sometimes they signed off on dear friend letters, like direct mail, or put an advertisement in the newspaper with celebrity names on it. And then more VIP type things, I guess you could say, were house parties, where it would be sort of a intimate gathering where, you knew in advance that it was for the purpose of meeting Martin Luther King or hearing more about civil rights. So it wasn't usually a surprise, but it was just more of an intimate gathering with probably not a ton of entertainment, more just mingling and then maybe hearing some speeches. So it seemed to me that there was a creative array of ways to make money.
Yet those 200,000 who pledged at the March on Washington might have become the foundation of such funding. Those 200,000 would have been the basic database of names and addresses for direct mail, which had become a major source of funding for the New Right during the 1970s and 1980s. However, by the mid-70s, the civil rights movement had lost focus. Blacks were making electoral gains, but thought that was enough to secure the victories won in 64 and 65. They had mistakenly demobilized themselves by thinking that merely by increasing their political ranks in local, state, and federal elections would be enough, not understanding, as did the right, that building a network of think tanks, political action committees, advocacy groups, and media, as well as direct action as a tool, would maintain pressure on the political system as their countervailing force.
But I do say that the bulk of the interpretation of whether this thing is going to end successfully and joyously or is going to end disastrously lays very heavily with the white community. It lays very heavily with the profiteers. It lays very heavily with the vested interests. It lays very heavily with a great middle stream in this country of people who have refused to commit themselves or even have the slightest knowledge that these things have been going on. And those who have decried demonstrations and who have said the Negro is going too far, they are the ones who in fact are being provoked the most by this, because for the first time, and it is only throughout demonstrations, that they have come to a level of consciousness. And in this now that we speak of, it is this point of no return, because we are on the march and there is going to be no return from it, because the march in Washington today is one thing, but it doesn't end there. There are going to be marches again, and there are going to be marches in the local villages and in the local cities, and it's not just in the South, it's in the North, it's all over.
As an entertainer, he was at the nexus of what Harold Cruse called the mass cultural communication industry, which Cruse saw as basic as oil, steel, and transportation. As a prominent black entertainer, Belafonte could have reached across a racial divide with his presence. Even King understood the value of blacks being in the mass cultural communication industry. He persuaded Nichelle Nichols not to resign from Star Trek, since she was the only black person on that show. Had King not been assassinated, it would have been plausible for him to ask Belafonte and Rustin to follow through with a new membership organization. But suppose this activist organization had creative and intellectual components. What would have been the mission of say, the Belafonte Institute, a not-for-profit? It would be dedicated to advancing the goals as articulated by the March on Washington of jobs and freedom through the arts, research, public policy, and civic engagement. Belafonte has shown it might have been viable since he was able to tap into the hearts and wallets of Hollywood celebrities. Rather than building popular organizations, what had progressives offered to so-called marginalized people in the post-civil rights era? Theory. No theory is hotter than critical race theory, which began appearing in the void left by the absence of a civil rights movement that wasn't able to move from protest to politics. Credited to Derek Bell, a former Department of Justice lawyer who went on to work for the NAACP's legal arm, Bell began to notice that civil rights laws were not effectively dismantling discrimination. Perhaps the reason why the civil rights laws were not as effective as lawyers thought they should have been is due to the fact that the civil rights movement stopped moving. As mentioned earlier, by the mid-70s, both the moderate civil rights wing and Black Power movements have stopped functioning, stopped organizing, stopped programmatically agitating. Instead, blacks began to focus on electoral politics without building a countervailing force. Why was the civil rights movement effective? It was so due to the fact it had mobilized people. However, critical race theory became a legal movement without a cause, meaning people. Critical race theory was basically doing the same thing that black political class had done during the defeat of Black Power, extricating itself from the masses of black people, offering theory in lieu of leadership. The fact that critical race theory could be easily isolated and denigrated by the right, as shown in the case of Chris Ruffo, is due to the fact that outside of academia, it has no network of support or even an apparatus to defend itself. Without recognizing it, critical race theory is merely echoing the same legalistic approach that the NAACP was known for prior to the Montgomery bus boycott of the mid-50s, but this time with deep academic theory. Critical race theory is the logical outcome of a movement in which today's academic sector of the black bourgeoisie the black professional managerial class perceives itself to be radical or oppositional by producing a theory that has left itself open to conservative bashing. Critical race theory is the perfect distillation of what has happened to progressive forces in the post-civil rights era, transforming itself from mobilizing oppressed people to confront issues to issuing theories about power. The left prefers to theorize about power, or the lack thereof. Meanwhile, the right, with a different take, created the Federalist Society, which has captured seats throughout the federal judiciary and placed jurists on the Supreme Court of the United States. Who is serious about power? I want to thank my guest, Emily Raymond, author of Stars for Freedom. This has been From Black Power to Black Trauma. I'm Norman Kelly. Thank you for listening.
Bye.